The wind was a sculptor on that high, lonely prairie, carving the dust into ghosts that danced and died against the grey timber of the cabin. It was a land of harsh truths and long silences, and Elias was a man made in its image. He moved with the spare economy of someone who has learned that waste, of motion or of words, is a luxury. The rhythmic tap of his hammer against a fence post was the only sound to challenge the wind's mournful song. He was mending what was broken, a task that was never finished, not on the fence line, not within himself. He felt them before he saw them, a subtle shift in the vast emptiness, a disruption in the day's bleak rhythm. A woman and a small child, trudging up the long, rutted track to his door. The county wagon that must have brought them was already a dark speck shrinking against the horizon, a final, definitive retreat. She was not a prairie woman, her clothes were for a town, her face pale with a weariness that went deeper than the journey. The boy, no older than 5, held fast to the fabric of her skirt, his small face a study in stoic observation. They stopped a few feet from him, the wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face, and waited. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a silent, unmovable fact that had arrived at his doorstep, her presence a question he did not want to answer. He let the hammer fall from his hand, the thud against the hard-packed earth unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. The inside of the cabin was as Spartan as the man who lived in it. A stone hearth, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding the barest of necessities. The air smelled of wood smoke and solitude. Elias ladled water from a bucket into 2 tin cups, his movements deliberate, slow. He set them on the table, a silent offering. The woman, Ilara, guided the boy to a chair and pushed the cup towards him before taking her own. Her hands, he noticed, were raw and chapped, but they moved with a gentle certainty as she smoothed the boy's hair. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the child's soft sips. Finally, she reached into the pocket of her worn coat and pulled out 2 items. The first was a piece of paper, folded into a tight square, its creases worn nearly through. The second was a $5 bill, crumpled and soft as old cloth. She slid them across the rough-hewn table. He did not touch them. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Caleb sent me," she said, her voice raspy, as if pulled up from a deep, dry well. "He said you would honor it." Elias's eyes flickered to the paper. He knew his brother's hand, the way he pressed the pen to the page. The $5 sat beside it, an insult and a plea all at once. "The justice of the peace," she added, a faint tremor in her voice. "It's for him." The town, they weren't kind. A shadow crossed her face, the memory of a hurt still fresh. "They said things. That I was too much. Too big a burden for any decent man." Elias looked at her then, truly looked. He saw not the woman the town had named and dismissed, but the fierce, desperate resilience in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in the eyes of a trapped animal, a look that knew it was cornered but refused to break. The journey into town was a study in silence. The wagon wheels ground against the gravel, a relentless, grating sound that filled the space between them. Elias kept his eyes on the horses, the reins held loosely in his scarred left hand. Ilara sat straight-backed on the bench, the boy nestled between them, his small body a fragile truce. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the prairie wind. The justice of the peace was a thin, tired man with ink-stained fingers who looked at Elias with a kind of weary pity. He had signed Elias's brother's death certificate 2 years prior. He read Caleb's note, glanced at the $5 bill, and performed the brief, sterile ceremony without comment. He declared them married under the disinterested gaze of a mounted deer head. As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Elias saw Henderson, the general store owner, leaning in his doorway. Henderson's face, a fleshy map of smug certainty, was creased in a sneer. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Collecting another stray, "Elias," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry. "Hope this one's worth the $5. Elias did not flinch, did not turn his head. He simply guided Ilara and the boy back to the wagon. It was only later, back at the cabin, as she stood uncertainly on the threshold, a bride in a borrowed life, that he spoke his first true words to her. He didn't look at her, his voice low and rough as stone. He mentioned you in his letters, Elias said, staring at the far wall. Said you were kind. Elara froze. Her hand, halfway to the doorframe, stopped in midair. It wasn't a welcome. It wasn't a command. It was a ghost, invited in. The first night established the new geography of the small cabin. Elara and the boy, Leo, took the single bed, a small island in the dim, firelit room. Elias laid a thin blanket by the hearth, his back to them, creating a shore he would not allow them to approach. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the stone, each pop and hiss amplifying the suffocating silence. He could feel their presence, the subtle weight of their breathing, a foreign rhythm in the song of solitude he had composed for himself. For 2 years, the only life in this room had been his own. Now it was threefold, a crowd. From the bed, a small voice cut through the quiet. "Are you my father now?" Leo asked, his tone one of simple, direct inquiry. Elias did not move. He stared into the twisting flames, watching them consume the wood, turning it to ash. The scar on the back of his hand, a gnarled landscape of silvered tissue, seemed to pull tight in the heat. He offered no reply, letting the silence answer for him. It was a cruel answer, he knew, but the only one he had. He heard a soft rustle as Elara pulled the boy closer, whispering something he couldn't hear. He closed his eyes, but sleep was a distant country. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, ambushed him in the dark, the grating shriek of rock, the sudden, terrifying darkness of the collapse, and the sound of his own voice screaming his brother's name, a raw, useless sound swallowed by the tons of earth and stone. He clenched his hand into a fist, the scarred skin protesting, as if the memory lived there, in the ruined flesh. The days fell into a fragile routine, a silent dance of avoidance in a space too small for secrets. Elara moved with a quiet efficiency, claiming her own territory. She cooked meals that were simple but filling, mended the boy's worn trousers, and began clearing a small patch of stubborn earth near the cabin, her hands coaxing life from the hard-packed ground. Elias worked from sunup to sundown, his labor a form of prayer, a penance. He repaired the barn roof, tended the few animals he kept, and rode the fence line, his silence a wall he rebuilt each morning. He felt the boy's eyes on him often, curious and unafraid. One afternoon, Leo followed him to the barn. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hay and leather. Elias was calming a skittish mare, his voice a low murmur, his scarred hand moving in slow, gentle strokes along her neck. The boy stood just inside the door, a small silhouette against the bright square of daylight. "Did it hurt?" Leo asked, his eyes fixed on the scar. Elias's hand stilled on the horse. He didn't turn. He just looked down at the twisted skin. For a moment, he considered ignoring the question, letting the silence do its work. But the boy's gaze was too direct, too honest for such a defense. "Yes," Elias said, the word emerging like a stone pulled from his throat. He said nothing more. The single word hung in the dusty air between them, a shared truth. Later that evening, when Elara tucked her son into bed, she found a small, intricately carved bird, whittled from a piece of scrap pine, lying on his pillow. Her gaze lifted, seeking Elias across the dimly lit room. He was already turned towards the fire, his posture feigning sleep, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. The wall had not fallen, but a single, tiny stone had been dislodged. When the time came to go to town for flour and salt, a journey Elias always made with grim determination, Elara was waiting by the wagon. She held a small cloth bag of her own, the boy standing resolutely beside her. "We're coming," she said. It was not a question. He simply nodded and helped the boy onto the seat. The air in Henderson's general store was stale with the smell of pickles, tobacco, and judgment. Henderson himself stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a dirty rag, his eyes missing nothing. He watched as Elias gathered his supplies, his movements clipped and efficient. He watched as Elara examined a bolt of calico, her touch gentle on the rough fabric. "Heard you bought yourself a wife, Elias," Henderson said, his voice slick with false bonhomie. He set the jar down with a thump. "Paid $5 for that one, I hear." At least she's built for winter. Plenty of her to go around. The other men in the store chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Elias's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped. His scarred hand curled into a fist at his side. He placed the sacks of flour on the counter and stared at a point just past Henderson's head, his silence a shield of ice. But before he could speak, or more likely, not speak, Ilara stepped forward. She placed her own small bag on the counter. He paid with his name, she said, her voice low but carrying a clarity that cut through the thick air. And in this town, that's worth more than your whole store. To a stunned silence fell. Henderson, for the first time, looked flustered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. On the wagon ride home, the silence was different. It was no longer a void between them, but a space they shared, fortified by a battle she had chosen to fight for him. That night, a storm broke over the prairie. Wind rattled the window panes and rain lashed against the roof in a furious, relentless rhythm, as if the sky itself were trying to scour the world clean. Inside, the fire spat and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the small cabin into a cavern of fears. Leo, startled from sleep by a deafening clap of thunder, began to cry, his small body trembling under the thin blanket. Ilara gathered him into her arms, rocking him gently, her voice a low hum against the storm's roar. To soothe him, she began to tell a story. "Sure, now," she whispered. "Let me tell you about a brave man. A very brave man who went looking for treasure deep inside a mountain with his brother Elias, sitting by the fire, went still. He kept his back to them, but he was listening, every nerve ending alert. There was a terrible noise," she continued, her voice soft but clear over the wind, "and the mountain groaned and fell down. The man's brother was trapped inside the dark. But the man, he didn't run. He stayed. He dug with his hands, Leo dug until his fingers were bleeding and the rock had torn his skin, trying to get to his brother." She paused, and in the quiet moment between gusts of wind, she looked directly at Elias's rigid back. "He couldn't save him. But he tried. He tried until he collapsed. He wasn't a coward. He was the bravest man there ever was." Elias felt the words like a physical blow. She knew. She knew the story the town whispered was a lie. He had carried the weight of their version for so long, that he had panicked, that he had failed, he had started to believe it himself. A hot, sharp pressure built behind his eyes, and a single tear he didn't know he possessed broke free, tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. For a long time, he did not move, letting her words settle in the quiet spaces of his soul. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent, leaving behind a profound and echoing quiet. Slowly, as if his limbs belonged to another man, Elias rose. He crossed the room to a small, dust-covered wooden chest that sat beneath his cot, a chest he had not opened in 2 years. The lock was stiff, but it gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, nestled in the scent of dried cedar and regret, lay the artifacts of a buried life. There was a matching wooden bird, older than Leo's, its edges softened by time and touch. And beneath it, a stack of letters tied with a piece of twine. Caleb's letters. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers clumsy, and pulled one from the middle of the stack. It was not the note she had brought him, the one that served as her introduction and his sentence. This one was different. He walked back across the room and held it out to her. Her eyes met his in the flickering firelight, questioning. She took the letter, her fingers brushing his, and unfolded it. The handwriting was Caleb's, bold and full of life. "I met a woman, Eli," it began. "Her name is Ilara. She has a son, a good boy. She looks at the world like it hasn't beaten her yet, and it makes me think a man can have a second chance. Makes me think of starting over. If anything happens to me out here, find her. You're the only one I would trust. The only one who would understand what it is to be responsible for someone he had known." He had known about her, about Leo. The note she carried was not a stranger's plea, it was the final piece of a plan, a brother's last desperate act of faith. The $5 hadn't been a payment for her soul. It was just the fee, the cold hard coin needed to bind them in the eyes of the law, just as Caleb had intended. She looked up from the letter, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dying fire. In that moment, watching him, she saw him fully for the first time. The man before her was not the cold, silent recluse the town saw, nor the broken failure he saw in himself. He was a man suspended in grief, a grief so profound he felt he had no right to claim it, choking on unspoken words and sorrows. She understood the crushing weight of his silence now. It wasn't a rejection of her, but a shield against a world that had already passed its judgment. Henderson's taunts, the town's whispers, they were just echoes of the verdict he had long ago delivered upon himself. Her defense of him in the store, she realized, hadn't been a calculated act of loyalty to secure her position. It had been a pure, unthinking instinct to protect someone she was beginning to recognize was just as lost, just as vulnerable as she was. Their marriage, born of desperation and a dead man's wish, was a strange and fragile vessel, but it was theirs. She rose from the bed, Leo sleeping peacefully now, and closed the small distance between them. She reached out, her movement slow, giving him time to retreat. He did not. Her fingers, surprisingly gentle, came to rest on the back of his hand, her thumb tracing the jagged, silvered lines of his scar. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, but he did not pull away. It was the first time they had touched not by accident or necessity, but by choice. A silent acknowledgement in the deep, quiet dark. The world was new in the morning. The storm had washed the air clean, and the rising sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A profound stillness had settled over the prairie, the kind of peace that follows a great and violent release. Outside, Leo was playing near the woodpile, chattering to the small carved bird Elias had made, his voice bright and clear in the crisp air. Elias stood in the open doorway, his customary post, but his reason for standing there had changed. He was not guarding his solitude, he was watching his life. Ilara came to stand beside him, the space between them no longer a chasm but a comfortable quiet. The unspoken things were still there, hanging in the air, but their weight had shifted. It was no longer the crushing burden of the past, but the substantial, hopeful weight of a future. She held the letter he had given her last night, the paper soft in her hand. Caleb wrote about a claim, she said, her voice even, not looking at him but at the distant, blue-hazed mountains that fringed the horizon. He said he found something. Before the collapse. He said it was for us. The word hung in the air. Us. A word that had not existed in this place yesterday. Elias followed her gaze to the mountains, those jagged teeth on the edge of the world where he had lost his brother and found his shame. He looked at the boy, so small and fearless against the vast landscape. Then, finally, he looked at her. Her face was calm, resolute. A new layer of truth had been revealed, a responsibility that went beyond shelter and food. It was a legacy. A map. A reason. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acceptance that was more eloquent than any word he could have spoken. The story was not over. It had just begun.